Welcome to the Writer Reads Mack and Me, an Odyssey. Book 2, Mack and Me, Blaedergil's Host. Chapter 16, One Blown Mission. Neither Mack nor I made it much further. We were belting toward the corridor just as fast as we could go when the doors along the corridor's edges began to open. "Go back!" Tens roared in our ears. "Get to the roof!" I wanted to argue, but I recognized some of the figures coming out of the doors, and no way in all the world did I want a single one of them to get within spitting distance, let alone touch range. Somehow, Skymander and his people had gotten far enough ahead of us to free the women in Blaedergil's upper floors and put them down here. They fucked with the security footage, Tens was explaining as we ran. Well, of course they had. Skymander knew about us taking Blaedergil. He knows we delivered Blaedergil's body to the Coravans. The only way I can think of that happening is if Lord Coravan told him. "I'll deal with him later," Max said, and his voice was a cross between a growl and a struggle to breathe. Laughing didn't even cross my mind. I was in exactly the same boat as he was. "Get to the roof," Tens had said. Fuck. I'd be lucky if I made it to the next floor, let alone past the next 3. I hadn't known exactly how true my words were until I saw movement on the floor above. "Mac?" "I see it." He was firing before he'd finished speaking, and I tried not to feel sorry as I watched the women above us start to drop. "Move, Cutter!" he roared, and I did my best to obey. We scrambled to the next level, and I shot a glance at the balconies outside the windows. They were starting to look downright inviting. We'd only have to shoot our way out onto them, or bull our way through 100 meters of diseased and highly infectious victims of Blaedergil's experimentation. That last thing? That so wasn't happening, but neither was running another flight of stairs. They were already above us and moving to cut us off. If we wanted to make it up to the next level, we had to make each shot count. I slowed my pace to take one step, aim and fire, and then go the next step. It was slow, but it was more efficient than running into a waiting or descending mob. Without taking out those closest to the stairs, we'd never have made it up the last 2 flights between us and the top floor. I hoped the feed in my implant remained uncontaminated this time, because I wanted to find out the name of each and every one of the people I'd been forced to shoot, and then I wanted to find a way to make Skymander pay for their loss, since he'd put them in harm's way to start with. For us, it was kill or be killed, but for him, it had been a pure exercise in obstruction. I vowed he'd pay for that, just as soon as I could find a way to make it so. Right now, Mac and I just had to get out of here alive. I was guessing this retrieval mission was blown. Yep. Mac's voice was quiet in my head, but angry. So very, very angry. I didn't blame him. I was angry too. "Does this thing have a rapid fire setting?" "It's indiscriminate." I waved a hand at the next flight of stairs. "You got an alternate route?" No sooner had I asked than a map rolled to the forefront of the implant, a line tracing a route to a second stairwell. Tens. "It's empty," he said before either of us could ask. "We locked it down before Skymander could get any of his people inside." Mac and I didn't wait to hear more, flicking the settings of our blazers to full auto and moving up the stairs at a faster pace. Way back in the 19th or 20th, humans had had something they dubbed a room broom. Odyssey had covered it in a brief history of one of their weapons suppliers. I couldn't remember the name of the gun, but room broom had stuck. It rolled through my head as I swept the blazer across the path in front of me in a single sweep, Mac's line of fire following my own. When it came time to reverse direction, the way ahead was clear, even if there were others shuffling forward to fill the gaps. They weren't moving fast enough, and I didn't want to think about why. Mac scanned the ones ahead, reached out to lay a hand on my shoulder as we came up to the fallen. I'll give him this. He was efficient, switching out the blazer for the smaller glazer and putting a single round into the head of each body we had to pass. It reminded me of what he'd said about Delight's team. With them, it's become second nature to put an extra round in the head of every corpse they see. Delight's team I could understand. They'd have gone places I didn't want to imagine, and if they were anything like Delight, they'd have had to double-check everything was dead because pretty much everyone they met was going to want to kill them first. I followed Mac, wondering where exactly he'd picked up the habit, but there was no time for questions. We'd hit the top of the stairs and there were more important things to worry about, like the 20 women between us and the stairwell we had to reach. Typical of Blaedergil to tuck his servants' access in some obscure corner, but it had also worked to our advantage. The rooms nearest it didn't seem to be occupied, and that meant less of his victims to avoid. Mac wasn't as fast as Bendigo. We'd taken about 10 apiece by the time he'd reached the stairs. Tens had the door open as we got there. "It's still empty," he said when we both hesitated, but his next words got us moving. "It won't be empty for long." "Monsters?" "Skymander's people." Well, damn. Mac led the way onto the landing and turned. I followed, not bothering with the door and relieved when it slid closed behind me. Looked like Tens had that much of our backs anyway. Thanks, I think. Screw you, I thought, and he laughed, reminding me again that I needed to work on keeping my thoughts out of the implant. Run. And I ran. Mac waited until I was alongside and then ran with me, and I wondered what for. Don't want to leave you behind. Condescending son of a bitch. We hit the top floor, and I expected to be wrapped in silver and teleported out of there, except that's not what happened. Tens? Looked like Mac was in the same boat. He's blocked teleport access to the internals. We're going to have to get onto the roof? I watched as the directions Tens had marked on the map in my head changed. At least we didn't have to go far. And move your asses. They're in the stairwell and gaining. Of course they were. They hadn't already run 6 flights, and the stars only knew how many corridors. I think they're Borgs. Tens again. Or augments. Mac. Yep. Then they what? Shut up, Cutter, came as a chorus. I gave them both the mental finger and followed Tenz's line to the nearest storage room. There's access from the stairwell, I said, eyeing another short flight up. I wondered why we weren't using the door at the top to access the roof, because of course Blaedergil had one. How else did he keep the top of his mansion looking shiny clean for the neighbours? I've plans for that. You'll need to make your own hole. Tens did not elaborate, but Mac and I found the hatch in the storage room. It led to what, in a smaller house, would have been the attic, and I wondered why Blaedergil needed one here. I pulled down the ladder as Mac shifted a few of the heavier boxes of cleaning supplies across the door he'd closed behind us. Lock it up, Tens. Done. And Tens sounded like he thought Mac should have known that already. Don't make me come up there. Old man, you are going to need me to get up here. Mac didn't have an answer for that, but I was already clambering up the ladder and not looking where I was going. It should have come as no surprise that the attic wasn't empty. It did come as a surprise that no one up here was a threat to either of us. They saw me come up the ladder and piss-bolted to the far end of the roof space. That suited me just fine. I didn't need to tell Mac what had just happened. He was already moving into the attic behind me. Where to now, Tens? Run right to the other end and then stand on something and make yourself an exit. Neither of us questioned him. He'd said he had plans for the servants' official entrance onto the roof, and I darn well knew that wasn't far enough away for my liking. I ran, and the servants started to scatter. "Stay where you are!" Mac roared, and they froze. Some of them even dropped to the floor and covered their head with their hands. If we hadn't already killed Blaedergil stone cold dead, then I would have wanted to go kill him again. Hells, I still wanted to kill him again, and again, and again, and again. Cutter, we have no time. Mac had stopped ahead of me and was pulling an empty cleaning crate away from the wall. Someone had been using it as a bedside table, but Mac moved their stuff to the bed alongside. When he had the crate positioned exactly where he wanted it, he stepped up onto it and held out his hand. Explosives. Well, sure, Mac, whatever you say, 'cause you know, please was never a fashion. I am going to kick your ass when we get back. Sure he was. I didn't bother adding another mental finger, just handed him the explosives. Tens was the one who called you old, I muttered, watching as he set the charges and jumped back off his crate. And speaking of Tens, on my count, the comms tech said, and I figured he had something planned to hide the sound of the explosion. Ten snickered inside the implant as Mac and I found cover behind another crate. It wasn't much, but the people closest took one look at what we were doing and pressed themselves into the furthest corners they could find, although none of them made to move past us and back to the end of the attic that we'd vacated. I guess living in fear gives you a sixth sense about things like that. Mac reached out an arm and wrapped it around me, pulling me close to his side. Hey! Shut it. I shut. Ten said, now, and the world exploded. Mac's explosives went off, but they were in no way responsible for the roar of destruction that engulfed the end of the attic closest to the servants' stair. It sounded like he'd brought down half the wall. You have no idea, he said. Now move. We moved, Mac boosting me up through the hole made by our own small charge. You're shorter, he said, and didn't have to elaborate. I'd been wondering exactly how I'd reach the ceiling, even with the crate. I pulled myself through the hole and scrambled up the roof and away from the drop. There's too much interference, Tens muttered in my head. Take that ridge line to the right and follow it as far as you can go. We did, moving cautiously along the roof, but not before looking back to see exactly what had happened in the direction of the stairwell. Well, that was impressive. It looked like Tens had cratered a corner of the roof and most of the stairs. Yeah, good luck following us out here. They could still find the access panel in the storage room, Mac reminded me. Spoil sport, I thought, but Mac didn't reply, and I followed him as he trotted along the ridge line of the roof as though he was following the top of a hill. I guess you could think of it like that, if you ignored the oh so many meters drop over the edge. Why did the man have to build such a tall mansion? I mean, why couldn't it have been a flat, friendly 2 stories or so? We followed the roof line around so that we were moving along the top of another wing of Blaedergil's property, and I was glad it was as wide as it was. All the better for the servants to stand on while they scrubbed, I supposed. We travelled in silence, slowly catching our breaths from the race up the stairs. When Tens interrupted, it was not good news. We've got company, he said, and Max slowed to a walk as he replied. We were nearing the far end of the roof anyway. What sort of company? The sort we have to run from. Fan-fucking-tastic, I thought. But Tens wasn't finished. If we don't catch you on this grab, then you're on your own. Mac and I looked back at the hole we'd made in the roof. There was movement just above it, a dark shape emerging, one that was clearly armed. As one, we turned back, gauging the distance to the roof's edge. I dipped my chin in a nod to show I'd go along with what Mac had in mind. The implant was good like that. Now, Max said, and we began to run. Now what? Tens wanted to know. If you don't catch us on this grab, Mac told him, his voice uneven as he ran, don't bother coming back. We'll be jam. I half expected Tens to ask why, but he was watching us on the scans. Fuck, he said, and I could hear others echoing the sentiment as Mac and I leapt outward. I'd like to say I was very brave. I really would, but that would be a lie. I ran because no way in all the stars was I going to let those bastards catch me, and I jumped because it was all there was left to do. Would Tens's teleport team catch me? I don't know, but they'd picked me up when I was in a speeding vehicle falling into a sewage pond, so I had to hope they'd pick me up now. I mean, me, on foot, had to be that much easier, right? Right, said Tens as my body stopped falling, leaving my brains and stomach to try and catch up, which was a technical impossibility given I'd been moved from one point in space to another and technically ceased to exist in between. I closed my mouth and opened my eyes, and silence descended as Mac did the same. Up until that moment, I hadn't realized we'd both been screaming. Tens had moved out from behind the console and was standing beside the platform, and he wasn't looking very impressed. You done now? I glared at him. It wasn't like I was the only one who'd been making the noise. I stood up, but Mac didn't move. When I looked back at him, he was sitting on the platform, his forearms resting on his knees and just staring into nothing. Looked like the stupidity of what he'd just done was starting to catch up with him. You coming, old man? I asked, and he turned his head enough to stare at me. Only Tens gets to call me that. I put one hand on my hip and cocked my head. Yeah? And Tens started to back up. I didn't need to see his face to know he had an inkling of what was coming. I kept my attention on Mack, taking a step toward him and extending one hand. Let me help you, I said, and to my surprise he took my hand and let me haul him to his feet, which also left my other hand free to wind back so I could punch him in the head. I let go of him as soon as I'd landed the hit, hearing him hit the floor behind me. Strangely enough, the teleport team had left the room. Tens, on the other hand, was leaning on the wall beside the door. I scowled at him, not liking the way he was positioned. He raised both hands and backed up a step. Son of a bitch! Max shouted, and I couldn't help the small chuckle that escaped me as I kept moving toward the door. I probably should have expected the sudden surge of movement behind me and the hand that grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and hoisted me off the floor. I unzipped the combat jacket enough to shrug out of it and dropped to the floor, and I didn't look back as I walked out the door, leaving the jacket dangling from Mac's hand. I need a shower, I said, and maybe to throw up. Both of which were true, if he could only be bothered to look inside my head. Of course, if he did that, he'd see the almighty finger I was crafting out of pixels made up of a multitude of one-fingered salutes. It helped keep the nausea at bay. Even so, I was surprised when he let me go. Nothing like sassing your boss and being allowed to walk away, no matter how bad you're starting to feel.